All right, so you know that the reef is supposedly in very poor condition. A new report just came out the other day by the Australian government saying that the Great Barrier Reef is in very poor condition, right? And went right round the world, you name it, everywhere is talking about this. Now, why does this matter? Well, we've just had an Australian government say that our biggest tourist attraction is in very poor condition. What do you think that might do to the tourist numbers in North Queensland, right? It would be like the German government saying, well, these Mercedes-Benz cars, they're really not much good anymore, right? And of course it has had an effect on the tourism in North Queensland, but it goes deeper than that because the agricultural industry in North Queensland there's new legislation coming in which is going to affect them drastically. Mines are being affected due to restrictions and also on the dredging of ports. So every major industry in North Queensland is actually affected by this. But it then goes even further because there's this preoccupation with the Great Barrier Reef. And it's not like Australia doesn't have some real serious environmental problems, but they're all being ignored because we're preoccupied with the Great Barrier Reef. All right, so I need a geography lesson. So this is the state of Queensland and the Great Barrier Reef is offshore, and the important thing about the Great Barrier Reef is that it's a long way from the coast, all right? I'm going to talk about the effect of agriculture, and there's a few reefs that are close inshore, but in fact they're not the Great Barrier Reef, and they're maybe 1% of the coral, and they're the ones that are actually mostly affected by agriculture. We'll come back to that a little bit later. All right, so the average reefs, there's about 3,000 of these reefs, and they're a few kilometres across, and you know they're very spectacular. Here's an example of a particular reef, and one of the interesting things about the reefs are that a large fraction of it is actually dead, right? So this is what we call the reef flat. There's great coral out the front, there's great coral out the back, and there's patches of coral on the top, but this is almost certainly dead. And the interesting thing is that a lot of marine biologists don't know why this died. And the reason it died is because over the last 5,000 years, the sea level has fallen. So there was the Holocene climatic optimum. The sea level in this area was about 1 metre higher than it is today. And so when the sea level fell, this coral that was here now gets exposed to the air on low tides. And of course, coral doesn't like sticking out of the water and it dies, all right? And it's often mistaken. If there is sea level rise from climate change, then this area of the reef will explode with new life. So we actually need sea level rise, global warming, and this area here will become... And there's actually no ifs, no buts about that. That is what would happen with sea level rise. All right, so another picture of the reef. So this is the land near Cairns where most of the tourists go. They head out to these reefs here mostly. The other 3,000 reefs are almost never looked at all. So the red areas of the reefs, it's about 50 metres deep around these reefs, and then you go off into the deep ocean. And of course, you go back 18,000 years, the sea level was 100 metres lower, and in fact, this was dry land. So these were flat-topped hills, and the Great Barrier Reef didn't exist, but there were fringing reefs along the along this sort of cliff edge into the deep ocean. So if we look at again, similar sort of thing, these are the reefs, and they're flat-topped hills on a plain with water about 50 to 100 metres deep, and the coral is there. So when the Aboriginal people arrived in Australia 50,000 years ago, these were all covered in trees and grass, right, and the sea level rose, and the reef was reborn only 18,000 years ago. So it's a fairly, in its present form, it's a fairly young phenomenon. All right, so, but the whole world is told that the reef is on its last legs, okay? So it is being killed by just about anything, all right? It's quite stunning, the imagination that is sometimes used. So sediment from agriculture, nutrients, which is fertiliser, pesticides, dredging, of course, climate change, overfishing, ocean acidification, medical drugs, sunscreen, antifoulant paint, coal dust. even land-derived fungal dust have been blamed for damaging the Great Barrier Reef. It is quite unbelievable. So we're just going to have a look at some of these supposed threats, which I pull out not quite at random, but there's so many to choose from that it's difficult to know where to start. All right. So this is a very famous paper showing coral growth rates as a function of time, 1900 to now, and you see the coral growth rates goes along and then it collapses. Very serious, went all around the world. How did they do this work? Well, this is a coral, and if you drill a hole in the coral, it looks like this, and you get like tree rings. So there's coral growth rings, and they looked at about 300 of these coral growth rings, but the problem was they made a little mistake, and we corrected that mistake. And by the way, it took about a year of work. They gave us the data, they were very good at that, and we found two major mistakes. And rather than this calamitous drop in coral growth rates, in fact, if anything, the growth rates increases. By the way, the dotted lines are the error margin. So if you consider the error margin, you actually can't really say that the growth rates have increased, but they certainly haven't reduced on this data. All right, now the important thing was this was a peer-reviewed piece of work, the original one in one of the best journals, Science or Nature, and it is wrong, all right? And this problem has never been corrected by the institution. Now, it turns out that other workers using similar methods have also found an increase in growth rate. So these guys here, Doliveau, found that the offshore Great Barrier Reef and the mid-shelf, which is actually the Great Barrier Reef, all right, there's about a 10% increase in growth rate since the 1940s. However, for the close inshore reefs, which is only 1% of the coral, there may have been about a 5% reduction. So essentially, this is a good news story. 99% of the Great Barrier Reef is growing 10% faster since the 1940s. But unbelievably, this is what the last paragraph or so of the paper says. Our new findings nevertheless continue to raise concerns. The more pristine mid and outer shelf reefs appear to be undergoing a transition from increasing to decreasing growth rates of calcification. So even though there's a good news story, somehow they managed to spin it into a bad news story for the media. All right, so as I mentioned, farms are supposedly, there's soil erosion, that's definitely true, and it's reaching the Great Barrier Reef and killing the Great Barrier Reef. Now, this is one of the most incredible things. I should say that I spent a lot of years working on sediment on reefs. In fact, my group and myself invented the instruments, were the first to take the long-term measurements of sediment on the reef. And my group has taken more of those measurements, or my old group, than all the other groups put together on the Great Barrier. So we know a little bit about this. Now, this is a typical picture of a typical reef. It's a very famous one, and you'll notice that there is no mud here. If you went down there, and that's sand, all right, it's coral sand, it's made of calcium carbonate, broken pieces of coral which have been pulverized. You take a handful of that sand, and it's almost 100% coral calcium carbonate. There is no terrigenous or land-based sediment on 99% of the reefs. So how can it be that the farmers are killing this? I really look at this and think, it makes the hypothesis that carbon dioxide is causing dangerous climate change a far more plausible proposition than that this reef is being killed by mud when there is no mud on the reef. And there's another picture. This is a very famous thing. This is all the coral sand. There's patches of reef around. The land is a fair way away, but this is actually the closest of the reefs to the land, and there is no mud here. All right, and of course there's a good reason, because the Great Barrier Reef, as we showed before, is a long way from the coast. But sometimes there is no doubt that the rivers flow, and just occasionally, like in this happened at the beginning of the year, my town, Townsville, got flooded out, and there was a big flood from this river, huge river. When it flows, this river is as big as any river in the most rivers in the world when it flows, but it only flows for a few days, maybe a week, in this sort of form, every few years. It's not like a Norwegian river. Australian rivers mostly don't flow, right? So it's true, they don't. This river, this doesn't flow. Now, but of course it was flowing pretty well, and there's a lot of soil erosion and it makes a mess. And of course pictures like this go all the way around the world. The Great Barrier Reef is being smothered by sediment. Well, the only problem is that this is the closest reef, all right? And it did have a small amount of muddy water go across it. A few milligrams per litre, as it turned out, all right? And then you've got to remember, this is one of 3,000 reefs, and it got a little bit of sediment for a few days. All the other reefs got nothing, and for the next 3, 5, 10 years, nothing, right? So even this worst case scenario, which has been told as, isn't it how terrible, it's actually saying the reef is fine. There is no problem. This is the worst, as bad as it gets, and there is no problem. By the way, it really is as bad as it gets, because generally speaking, these river plumes hug the coast and go along here. But because of the direction of the wind, it was actually pushed offshore much further than it usually did. All right, so that's the Great Barrier Reef, but it is true that these fringing reefs, the reefs that are very close to the shore, just 1% of the coral, they are certainly muddy. And I spent most of my career studying, amongst other things, these dirty reefs. So this is what I like to call the world's dirtiest reef. It probably isn't. But it's called Paluma Shoals, just north of Townsville. And you know, look at the colour of the water. This is not this sparkling, pristine blue water. It is muddy, all right? And it's muddy because the wind is blowing. You can see the waves on the surface there, and that is churning up the seabed, and there is mud on the seabed which has been laid down there for thousands of years, and that means that this reef is going to always have mud whenever it blows. And we were able to show with the geologists, God bless them, they've had more of an effect on the science here than all the biologists put together in a sense. They were able to drill holes in this reef and show that this has always been a muddy reef for the thousands of years that it's been around. So these two pictures, and hopefully you can see them, they're not the best pictures. This is the one which will be used to show the effect of the river plumes, and this is a different picture. Same river, muddy brown water, the coastline, and this is what I call the green plume. The Great Barrier Reef is further offshore, but you do notice that the reefs, which might be these little reefs on the islands along the coast, the Paluma Shoals is here, they are slightly affected by the sediment. But in fact, when you take measurements, you can't even see the effect of the sediment on the corals here. Now that was during the wet season, when for the few days when the river flowed. This is in the dry season, basically right now, except in 2007. And you notice again how muddy the water is along the coast. And the reason was the wind was blowing and it was stirring up the seabed, the mud that's been on the bottom since time immemorial. So these inshore reefs are not affected by the rivers, they're affected by the resuspension. And the resuspension is 10 to 100 times more concentrated for about 10 to 100 times longer than the effect of the river floods. And the net result of this is that even the inshore reefs are not affected by the sediment coming from the farms, or at least only minimally. But of course, the really big things that determine how much sediment there is the hurricanes. We call them cyclones. So a big cyclone, we had a whopper the other year, would resuspend maybe 500 million cubic metres. So 100 kilometres wide, it will go through and it will resuspend, 10 to 20 centimetres of sediment off the bottom and move it around. And it dwarfs the amount of sediment that comes down all the rivers. So all the rivers in a whole year might be a few million cubic metres compared to 500 million cubic metres from the cyclones. Right, but we're also told that the water quality is degraded and it's polluted. Well, it doesn't look too polluted to me. And it turns out, and this is work which I've been involved with, that the most important thing that determines the water quality on the reef is not the rivers flowing in with a bit of pollution. It's the massive ocean currents which flow in and flow out. And it turns out there's as much water comes in from the Pacific Ocean and out in 8 hours as comes down all the rivers on the whole coast in a whole year. So, of course, the water is sparkling clean for almost all the time. And this is a typical view of the Great Barrier Reef on a sunny day. It's just beautiful and blue. All right, so of course there's the big one. We'll talk about climate change now and the coral bleaches. And it's actually a story, as I say, made in heaven to say that global warming is really bad, because there is no doubt that under very warm conditions, a whole lot of coral dies. In fact, one of the things about coral, which makes it great to show calamities, is that it doesn't die just one at a time, all right? It dies by the area the size of Belgium will die overnight, literally with a cyclone or with a bleaching event. So it's spectacular. All right, we need to talk a little bit about bleaching, but before we do that, let's talk about whether corals like warm weather. Well, of course they do. You do not go to Norway to find coral reefs. You actually, if you want the best coral reefs, you don't even go to northern Australia. You go to the equatorial area around Thailand and Indonesia for the best coral reefs. If you plot temperature versus coral growth rates, you find that there is a linear increase. And in fact, corals will grow right up to about 38 degrees, which is close to 10 degrees hotter than what we have on the Great Barrier Reef. Hot water is good for the Great Barrier Reef. All right, but let's look at the bleaching, and we need to have a little biology lesson. So corals are made up of little animals called polyps, and inside those animals are these little zooxanthellae. They're an algae which give it its colour, and they also live in symbiosis with the polyp to provide energy for the coral. Now, there's different types of coral. There's hundreds, thousands of different types of coral. There's these ones here, the sort of the staghorn ones, and there's these big ones, but it's basically the same idea. All right, now, it is a masterpiece of cooperation, but for some reason, when the water gets hot, or if it gets cold, or if there's fresh water, the coral ejects the algae inside it. But it's not a death sentence. So if you get hot weather, it's not a death sentence. Most of the coral will recover from that. An analogy in Australia is that in very, very dry conditions, trees will drop their leaves to conserve water, right? They will usually recover. It's actually a strategy for life, not a death sentence, and bleaching is similar to that. All right, the important things about corals, though, is that they have the ability to, they're actually born without this algae. They take it in from the water, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in a moment, because it's very, very important, because they can choose the type of algae that's inside them for their best advantage. All right, now it turns out that the corals that are much more likely to be killed by bleaching, hot water, are these staghorn corals. Now just look at them, they're very delicate. If I grab one of those, I can break it off, no problems at all. In a cyclone, in a hurricane, they will all be totally destroyed, and they will be totally destroyed roughly every 20 years, okay? Now, the thing about corals is that these ones here, these acroporas, is that they're killed by everything. They're killed by bleaching, they're killed by fresh water, they're killed by hot water, and they're massively killed by cyclones, right? On the other hand, corals like this, these live for hundreds of years, okay? And they are very unlikely to be killed by bleaching. They sometimes are, but not usually. All right, so why is this important? Well, the thing is that the coral has the ability to take in different types of this algae, and it can take in what I call a sort of a low octane zooxanthellae algae, and this will give it resistance to bleaching. So hot water, no problems, but it will probably grow slowly. And that's not a good thing if all the other corals are trying to outcompete you, right? On the other hand, you can take in a high octane zooxanthellae, which is what these staghorn corals will often do, and it will make you grow very quickly, but if it gets hot, you will die, all right? So there's a trade-off. And the interesting things about corals is they can bleach and then take in a different type of algae if they decided, well, that was the wrong one, I got bleached, I'm going to take in a low octane one, and they can do that sort of thing. And lots of corals have a few different strains of the algae in them. So what you're seeing here is a masterpiece of ability to deal with changing temperatures. Whereas the rest of us, we have to go, if we want to adapt to a hot weather, we're going to have to go through 10 generations, which in the case of human beings will be a few hundred years, to adapt. What does coral do? Just get rid of that zooxanthellae, bring in a new one, we're good to go for another, 2 or 3 degrees hotter. No problems at all. And that's important. And it's also perhaps not surprising that they can do that, because one of the things about, I'll come back to that in a second, the temperature does change. So this is a temperature record from our area, and you'll notice that when Captain Cook discovered the east coast of Australia, at least, the temperature was around about the same as what it is here. So temperatures fluctuate and corals can deal with it. I like to say bleaching is a little bit like a bushfire, and we have a lot of these. It's very spectacular and everything gets killed apparently, but it grows back. And it grows back within about 10 to 20 years, which is the sort of the cycle time of death and destruction on the reef. Virtually everything's going to be wiped out within 20 years and it will regrow. So it starts like this, looks good, looks terrible, and it grows back. Not surprising. Now there's a very good reason why corals need to have the ability to deal with massively changing temperatures. And the reason is that if a coral spawns here, it could float up in the North Queensland current and end up in an area which is 1 or 2 degrees hotter. It's not like a seed from a tree which just drops its seed and it lives in the same climate. It could go south and it would be colder. So you need this ability to deal with different temperatures. All right, I should talk about crown of thorns starfish, because this was the first big scare on the Great Barrier Reef. It wasn't the climate change. We were told that these starfish, which definitely go plague proportions, they chomp through massive amounts of coral roughly every 15 years or so, and that nowadays they blame the farmers for this. Right, so what they say is that the farmers, because of the nutrients from the fertiliser, it fertilises the crown of thorns starfish larvae, and this is why we have these plagues. But in fact, the evidence is incredibly weak. And one of the main reasons it is weak is that in the Great Barrier Reef there is 100 times more nutrients, phosphates and nitrates, cycling across the seabed than comes down all the rivers. So in fact the rivers are a very, very minor thing. The other thing is that the biologists very conveniently ignore other evidence, like a whole bunch of the starfish experts say the link between farmers and the fertiliser is completely unresolved. But if you look at the equivalent of the IPCC report, so on the reef it's called the Great Barrier Reef Consensus Report, they don't worry about the evidence that goes against the claim. It's exactly the same process that happens as in the IPCC. They also totally ignore the geological evidence where we know that these plagues have been around for thousands of years. The biologists would claim crown of thorns starfish plagues have only been around since 1960. Bleaching has only been around since 1979. Before that, it never occurred, all right? And this is crazy. Of course, we didn't know about it because back in 1971, there was about 5 marine biologists working on the reef. By now, there's thousands. We just didn't know about these things. And so when we discover them, we suddenly decide, it must be due to us. There is one exception to that. In 1982, they discovered mass coral spawning. Every coral on the whole Great Barrier Reef releases its eggs in one night, 2 nights maybe, causing massive slicks of eggs on the surface. You can see it from a satellite image virtually, all right? Now, they will never say, mass coral spawning never happened before 1982, would they? Because that's a miracle of nature. And we didn't know about it to science because the scientists weren't there. But crown of thorns starfish plagues or coral bleaching, that just occurred in the last few decades. And it's our fault. So if coral dies, it's our fault, but these other things are not. All right, so there are many other examples of very, very untrustworthy science. For example, you would have heard that maybe 93% of the coral reefs bleached in 2016, the big event. But actually, when you look at the data, maybe 8% of the coral died in 2016. Now that sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Right? 8% died. But consider that the southern third of the reef, there was a 250% increase in the amount of coral in just 6 years. So an 8% reduction really isn't a big deal. One of my favourites is this one here. There's a paper on coal dust. So we're a big exporter of coal on this coast, and apparently the coal blowing off the conveyor belts reached up to 200 kilometres away and was potentially damaging the reef. The only problem was that, well, actually they weren't really necessarily even measuring coal. They were just measuring some sort of polyaromatic hydrocarbon. But they managed to completely screw up the analysis by a factor of 30. So the numbers were out by a factor of 30. Then another very famous scientist exaggerated the area from just 200 kilometres to 2,000 kilometres by a factor of 10 effectively, and he did that in front of a Senate inquiry calling for some of the coal ports effectively to be closed down on completely bogus data, right? So as I say, this makes this thing on climate change look sane. Some of this stuff is completely crazy, because whereas in Norway, you know, the effect of the policies on climate are having a bit of an effect, in North Queensland it's potentially having massive effect in the next few years. And then there's pesticides are supposedly killing the reef. But actually when you look at the data, they never even measure it out on the Great Barrier Reef because they're so low, because of all the flushing from the Pacific Ocean. Close inshore, on this 1% of the corals, even there, most of the time, most of the chemicals are not detectable even with the most sensitive scientific equipment. And they only, in a couple of places, just get, for a short period of time, to a very minimal effects level. And yet, there's now new legislation restricting the use of pesticides on all the farms on the east of the Great Divide. And then there's this one. Maybe this definitely is my favourite. Apparently, pharmaceuticals from sewage is a medium risk to the Great Barrier Reef, right? This is when you take a headache tablet, it passes through your body, goes to the sewage treatment plant, goes out to the Great Barrier Reef, which is up to 100 kilometres, in many cases more, from the coast, and somehow is a medium risk. So I looked at this because I've had a lot of spare time recently, looked at the report. And you go to the paper and you find a report and you see the appendices and you think, well, where is the data on the concentrations? And you find they didn't actually even measure it on the reef. And you think, well, did they measure it close inshore? No, they didn't measure it close to the coast. Almost all the measurements are taken on the outlet pipe of the sewage treatment plant on the coast, right? And even there, they were very low levels. Take no account of the billions, or I don't know, hundreds of billions maybe, times dilution that would occur, and just say medium risk, all right? And yet another one of these things. So it really is shocking. This is a famous picture. It was one that actually initially got me into a bit of initial bother. It was in the late 19th century, showing an area sticking out of the water, showing apparently good coral, all right? But today a bare wasteland. And this always struck me as being very, very dubious. So I was employing a few guys and I said, go down to this spot, there's very low tides, lowest tide of the year in the middle of the day, see if you can find any coral, all right? Because these pictures were being used to demonstrate that all the inshore reefs were being affected by farmers, all right? So they were serious, right across in reports, in blogs everywhere. But you actually go there and it turns out there's spectacular coral in this local vicinity. And when I spoke to a journalist about it and said, you need to question the quality assurance processes that were used, all right? So I wasn't annoyed that they'd screwed up, right? But what I did want to know was, how careful were they to make sure this story that they were telling, which is affecting every farmer in North Queensland, how careful were they to make sure it is right? So this is what I focus on, the quality assurance. And by simply asking that question on quality assurance, you get into a bit of problems. All right, so let's look at the pulse of the Great Barrier Reef. So this is the coral cover with time. And by the way, the data from about 1990 is reliable. Before 1990, it's probably not quite so good. The northern region of the Great Barrier Reef, 20% coral cover, which is normal, right, about normal. You see it goes along and it's crashed. And that was the big bleaching event in 2016. All right, but you see, it's also already, it's starting to recover. And I'll put $100 on the table and say by about 2022, it'll be back up to here. All right, the Central Great Barrier Reef, you see it goes up and down, a big crash here, it comes up, about twice the coral there than there was here, and it's come back down. That is largely another very minor bleaching event, but also a big cyclone went through. This one, talking about big cyclones, if you get the right one, can destroy enormous amounts of coral. Right, this is the Great Barrier Reef. It's offshore, all right? There it is out there, and this was a Category 5 cyclone, all right? You couldn't have picked, well, you could have just picked a better course to destroy the most amount of coral, but that cyclone destroyed about half the Great Barrier Reef, all right? Just in about 3 days. And you can see it in the data. All right, so you can see the data coming along, crash, all right, and then it's grown back, and it's now there was another cyclone here which has reduced it. But essentially, if you look at the coral cover with time, yes, this has been the biggest event, a cyclone, but we've more or less got about the same amount of coral now as we always used to. All right, I mentioned this graph. It is an important graph because it supposedly looks at the coral cover if you go back to the 1960s. This is coral cover, 1960s, and this chugs along. This has been, there's more data now. Very famous paper, been cited literally thousands and thousands of times, and it supposedly says there's been a reduction in coral cover from up there down to here. Now, anybody looking at this graph will see that is a very suspicious looking graph, isn't it, all right? Because you've got all this scatter, and then all the data is actually very close together. So what they did here was because we've got good data from about 1985, 86 onwards, and really only good data from about 1990 onwards, this is a bit dubious too. Before 1985, they went back to the literature. So in 1961, some scientists measured a little bit of coral cover somewhere, and there's your point, 40% coral cover. Whereas this new data, they actually, this is very good quality data, they survey 100 to 200 corals, and they go right around it, literally thousands of kilometres of transect go into each one of these points. Whereas this one might be one survey of a square metre, literally, in one place, all right? And of course, this is why that there is massive scatter. And of course, they weren't interested in trying to get a long term. They were doing some experiment on the coral, and they measured coral cover. Bang, the data point goes in. So there's basically no way that you can take this data and append it to that data. It's a little bit like the man hockey stick curve, all right? Very similar to that, but far worse in my view. It has another resemblance in that when we actually asked the scientist involved, how did you get these data points? Where in the literature did you actually get these to aggregate them? He wouldn't give us the data. He still hasn't given us the data. We've actually tried to get the journal Nature to ask for the data, and they still haven't produced the data, all right? So we try to do it ourselves. We went to the literature, and this is our results versus their results, and you see it's total scatter. We couldn't replicate the data, and we believe that paper should be retracted. It's basically complete rubbish, and it's just another example of very, very poor quality science that used on the Great Barrier Reef. All right, I'm going to try not to go on for too long here, but I do want to just give a little summary. All right, so essentially the coral cover on the reef has effectively not changed. There's no doubt that it goes up and down in massive swings. And this is very important because if you want to prove to the world that the reef is dying, it's great because every few years you can take pictures of killed coral, massively killed coral, and not just a little bit, as I say, huge areas of coral, and then you ignore the gentle growth that occurs in the following years. There is excellent coral on all 3,000 reefs of the Great Barrier Reef. In fact, there's not a single reef that we've lost that we know of, except one, all right? I know of one tiny little reef that was probably not much bigger than this lecture theatre, right at the mouth of the Townsville port. And with all the port work, it's been covered by sediment. But, you know, this is just an insignificant. Of the main reefs of the GBR, there's the same amount, there's great coral on all of them. If anything, the growth rates have not declined. If anything, they've increased, all right? So growth rates are increased. And by the way, that's exactly what you would expect. With a warming climate, and the climate has warmed over the last 100 years, you would expect corals to increase in growth by almost exactly the amount that they have, all right? Crown of thorns starfish plagues are almost certainly totally natural, and even though we're going to spend $100 million trying to kill these things, totally pointless exercise, it's probably the worst thing we can do. Crown of thorns starfish are not a feral animal. In Australia, we have terrible problems with feral animals like cats, foxes, and these sorts of things, cane toads. They are from somewhere else and they've come in. Crown of thorns starfish are natural. It would be like going into the Australian bush and killing koalas, all right, because they're eating too many eucalyptus trees. We would never do that, but we do kill crown of thorns starfish. I guess they're not furry animals. Now, the changing pH of the ocean, so this is they call it, acidification, but it's not acidification. But the CO2 changing the ocean pH, my bet is that that won't ultimately be a problem, but if you look at some of the experiments, and some of these experiments seem to be done quite well, there does seem to be a reduction in growth rate if you double the amount of carbon dioxide. But we're not seeing this slowing of growth rates in the data from the actual corals as yet. Essentially, in terms of the farmers, there is no land-derived sediment on the Great Barrier Reef where 99% of the corals live. So how can the farmers be blamed for this? But they are. Nutrients are not measurably different on the Great Barrier Reef as they are in the Pacific Ocean, so farm fertilisers are irrelevant, but the farmers are being blamed. And pesticides, well, essentially, you can barely measure them at all. So my take-home message is, and the North Queensland tourist industry wants to push this, the Great Barrier Reef is absolutely fabulous. It's still, by far, the best reef in the world. It's the one with the least pressure. You know, the Caribbean has got probably 50 to 100 million people living around it. The Great Barrier Reef, 500,000. Along a coastline of 2,000 kilometres, it is one of the most pristine environments in the world, full stop. It's absolutely fabulous. Don't worry about it. Thanks very much.